As I say, hope everybody is managing okay in the weather. Is keeping as cool as you can and hydrated. But thank you for joining us for this webinar today. I think we're together for an hour. We're looking at essential HR for small charities, and in this webinar, hoping to give you sort of an awareness of the main employment rights for employees within your organisation, or if you are looking to perhaps engage your first employees. And then I'm going to talk through as well some of the key recent and forthcoming impacts from the Employment Rights Act, just to give you an understanding and hopefully an awareness of what's going on, and just highlight a couple of changes that have happened and are coming up that I think are just really important to make sure that you're aware of, and for the sort of forthcoming change, thinking about what you might need to do in your organisations. The session that we're going through today, it's going to focus on individuals who are employed by your organisation. So it's not something that's focused around volunteers or kind of self-employed contractors. But I'll just start by introducing myself and Roots HR. So I'm Alison Smith. I am CEO and lead consultant of Roots HR. We're a specialist consultancy for HR in the social sector. So we are a social enterprise ourselves. We're a community interest company. We were founded in 2009 on that basis as a social enterprise, and providing services to organisations who are not for personal profit. So other social enterprises, charities, other not-for-profit type of organisations. And as a social enterprise, we use our trading surpluses to provide pro bono free HR services and learning and development to managers and leaders within the sector. So this webinar today, as part of Small Charity Week, is fully funded by our Social Impact Fund. So it's free of charge for everybody to join, because it's a key part of us delivering our social purpose about trying to improve, people management skills and develop managers in the sector. So that's all delivered under our umbrella of the Roots HR Academy. And I'll talk to you at the end. I'll just highlight a couple of other things that we've got going on at the moment in regard to Small Charity Week, just to make sure you're aware of those and don't miss out on those. So what we're going to go through, as I say, throughout the session, we're going to talk about these sort of legal minimums and then some normal or better practices that you could consider for your organisations. And that's going to be around the kind of HR framework, policies, etc. And then we'll touch on changes in the Employment Rights Act, as I said, what that's going to bring, not only through this year, but into 2027 as well. Although obviously highlight and caveat that with the change that we had at the start of this week, in the fact that we know now that there's going to be a change in Prime Minister. We don't know as yet what impact that might have on any aspects of the legislation that haven't yet been implemented, if any. So I'll just caveat that. And throughout the session, I'm going to try and signpost you to further guidance. We'll send through a copy of the slides after the session. There are some links in a few of the slides. So we'll signpost you to any sort of free HR support tools and guidance that we can as well. So I'm going to start by looking at these minimum compliance. So let's look at the absolute minimum that we need to have in place as our sort of HR framework. So this would be if you've got employees in place, or if you're looking to engage your first employee. So as soon as an organisation employs even one person, then there are a significant set of legal obligations that come into play. These are non-negotiable, so they're absolute minimums that you need to make sure that you're meeting. And they really focus around sort of pay, tax, contracts, and then a whole set of sort of protections for employees as well. Around pay, compliance is really key. And if we look at pay and tax, the columns there, a lot of this includes HMRC. So you need to register with the HMRC as an employer. You need to set up a payroll and make sure that you're able to and have systems in place to be able to make statutory deductions, so things like tax. national insurance contributions, and any other statutory payments. Now, you might have in-house payroll. For a lot of organisations, that's something that they will outsource, even as a small charity, outsource payroll to another provider who can help you in terms of things like the registration with HMRC and setting up a payroll. You're legally obliged to provide individuals with an itemised pay statement. So that's what we typically think of as a pay slip. In respect of pay, then obviously you have to pay at least the national minimum wage rate, including the, if you've got apprentices, the apprentice rate, the national living wage rates dependent on age where appropriate. Those rates, as I'm sure you're aware, tend to change every April. So it's just making sure that you pay those rates and that you consistently monitor and amend those rates on an annual basis. And you also have to comply with your obligations around providing a workplace pension. So this was when auto-enrolment, making sure that we're auto-enrolling people into pensions. On contracts, you are minimum compliance, you are legally obliged to provide a written statement of terms and conditions of employment, which is what we will typically think of and talk about as a contract of employment. And this must be provided to the individual in writing no later than day one of their employment with you. There used to be a longer lead-in time before you had to issue the contract. Now it's by no later than day one of employment. There are also some responsibilities and protections that individuals have when they're employed by your organisation. In terms of paid leave, then individuals as a minimum are entitled to, for a full-time employee, 5.6 weeks a year of paid annual leave. That equates to 28 days, which includes bank holidays as minimum compliance. That would be for a full-time employee. You would prorata that entitlement down if somebody was engaged on a part-time or part-year contract of employment. There are important protections for individuals, for employees in respect of health and safety, and your responsibilities as an employer will apply regardless of the size of your workforce. You have an obligation under the Health and Safety at Work Act to provide a healthy and a safe workplace for your staff, for your employees. What that will consist of as a minimum is making sure that you have assessed your risks. So what are the risks that your workers might be exposed to in the course of their duties, going about their day, their work with you, and making sure that they're given basic training. So thinking about your risks, assessing those risks, what can be put in place to mitigate those risks, and then looking at what's the basic training that you need to provide to employees to be safe in terms of doing their job role. There is a requirement around policy, which I'll come on to a bit in regards to health and safety. You will be obliged as an employer to have a employer liability insurance in place, and you'll be required to undertake things like right to work in the UK checks. You must also ensure sort of fair and lawful treatment of your workforce. So that will include things like non-discrimination, so not discriminating against employees, and making sure that you're compliant in regards to data protection. We do have a fact sheet. There's a link here to a fact sheet on this slide, which is called Starting to Employ, which goes through this information in a bit more detail for you. But thinking about sort of good practice and scaling requirements, if your organisation starts to grow, alongside legal duties, there is a strong expectation from individuals who are in the general workforce, entering the general workforce, a strong expectation of good practice. And for organisations, good practices can help support consistency within your organisation, perhaps in terms of how managers manage people and overall management of risk for your organisation. So even where they're not legally required, early adoption of kind of clear policies or documentation as a framework can really help protect the organisation. So there's some core documentation that you might want to consider implementing early. That will include things like job descriptions. Job descriptions along with their person specifications are really important and helpful because they start to articulate to post holders what the expectations are that you have of them within their role. So the roles and responsibilities, the outcomes, the what you want them to deliver in your role. And also there's likely to be some aspects of sort of behaviours in there as well, attributes that you're expecting people to demonstrate, the how that they go about working for you. So those are really important. Some core documentation that you're required to have in place from a health and safety perspective, risk assessments we've talked about, but also a health and safety poster or leaflet. So posters are typically displayed in, physical workspaces. If you're working remotely or hybrid, you can have it as a leaflet format. We have it as a leaflet. It's in one of our Teams channels so that all the employees can easily access that. There might be some core policies that you look to put in place in early on, especially if they're relevant to the work that people are undertaking for you. So safeguarding, are you providing services to vulnerable adults, children? IT acceptable use policy, again, depending on the work that you've got, seeing the prevalence of AI being used in workforces, is it helpful to have an IT policy? Equality and diversity policies to help, again, just sort of demonstrate, perhaps even as part of an attraction tool, about the type of employer that you want to be and that you are, to sort of attract people, retain them within your organisation. But you should also think about role-specific requirements within the jobs that you have as well. Now, there might be some jobs where you're looking at DBS checks. You might have a legal requirement in some roles to undertake a criminal records check. You might have obligations from funders or commissioners to look at specific practices or processes or training for your staff as well. Fair or safer recruitment practices, again, things like safeguarding might be requirements on you by other organisations that you're working with. And then as you start to scale up as an organisation, some policies become more important or helpful to you. So health and safety, this is a legal requirement once you've got 5 or more employees or workers in place, you have a legal requirement to have a health and safety policy. So that's in addition to your poster, your risk assessments. Then again, sort of thinking about managing risk for the organisation or managing recurring situations, you might want to start to think about other policies. So sickness, disciplinary and grievance procedures. Although with disciplinary and grievance procedures, you don't necessarily have to have those in place because as a minimum, you should be just complying with the ACAS code of practice. And then, if you're getting to 10, 15 plus employees, you might think about some broader policy frameworks. Again, thinking through the lens of fairness and consistency for your workforce, both so that they understand their entitlements, but that managers understand how to manage their direct reports. So for fairness and consistency, thinking about, reoccurring situations, it might be that you start to look at having policies around flexible working or family leave. It might be that you want to look at more of a formalised or formal pay structure in place, or a policy around how you manage pay and reward, and a staff handbook, again, just along these lines of consistency. So when it comes to policies, the types of things that we would typically recommend, as a minimum, outside of the policies, you're going to have your contract of employment templates, your health and safety poster or leaflet, and your risk assessments. But when thinking of policies, as I say, think about 5 or more workers, you're required to have a health and safety policy. What do you need in your organisation to manage risk? Where are the risks in your organisation? What policies would be helpful there? again, health and safety? Is it standards for IT usage? Is it data protection? Is it safeguarding? Thinking about those reoccurring situations in your organisation, is something like managing absence and leave going to be helpful for you? And then, do your commissioners or funders have any requirements? And again, this concept of attraction and potentially becoming an employer of choice. What are going to be positive policies for you to implement that might help you both in attracting and retaining employees, things like equality, diversity, inclusion. So there are some policies that, you know, we might typically recommend, things like equality, diversity, you know, IT, absence leave, data protection, but think this through the lens of what is relevant to your organisation. As a minimum requirement, your only legal obligation is that health and safety policy once you've hit 5 or more workers, but think about what's relevant to your organisation. And if they're written well and implemented well, policies and procedures can really provide you and your managers and your workforce, as I say, with this framework of good practice and consistency. And that can obviously help in terms of ongoing people management in your organisation. So that's kind of what we think about as the sort of the initial HR framework that will help you when you start to take on your first employee, or when you're, you know, at that sort of, you know, 5 or even 1 through to 15 employees as you start to scale up. The more you kind of scale, again, just in terms of your framework, keep thinking about what are the risks, what are the recurring situations that we're dealing with, what are the requirements on us from others, like funders, commissioners, and how do we want to see ourselves, our culture, our workplace well-being, etc., and use those to guide you in terms of the sort of framework of policies to have in place. But there are things that are changing around, again, legal requirements through the Employment Rights Act. So I'm going to move over for us to have a look at those. The Employment Rights Act itself, it's a very ambitious piece of legislation. It's set to change many HR practices. The Act is now at implementation stage. There are various elements of the Act that have recently gone live or are about to be implemented throughout 2026 or 2027. And there are some aspects that are proposed within the Act that require some secondary legislation to implement them. So some of the areas that we'll talk about today are in consultation at the moment. So the government is going out to consult with individuals, organisations, employers, etc., to get feedback on the proposals that will then inform what the secondary legislation looks like and what you will need to comply with when that is implemented. But yes, so some things will require secondary legislation. So we wait to hear on some issues or some changes that are proposed. But thinking in terms of what's happened to date, there are a number of reforms that have already come into force so far in this year. And there is a signpost in one of the slides later on that links you through to a page on the ACAS website where they've got a timeline of changes that have happened and changes that are coming up. So you don't have to sort of scribble loads of notes as I'm going through this, just in terms of what's already changed, so that you can make sure that you've got a full understanding of what you should already be compliant with. There were some changes introduced in February of this year that really relate to trade unions and focus around changes to compulsory recognition. That affects organisations when they've got 21 or more workers. So I'm not going to go into detail on that today, but some of the previous obligations on trade unions where they were seeking compulsory recognition in organisations of 21 or more workers have been abolished, just making it potentially slightly easier for that compulsory recognition to be achieved. But in April of this year, there were some changes that were implemented. Paternity leave and unpaid parental leave are now a right from day one of employment. So previously there was a length of service requirement for employees. That's been abolished. So when employees join you from day one of their employment, they have the right, if they're eligible, to request paternity leave or unpaid parental leave. Quite a significant change happened in regard to statutory sick pay, or SSP. SSP is now an entitlement from day one of the period of sickness absence, and there's no minimum weekly earnings limit now to be eligible for the payment. So prior to April, SSP had what were known as waiting days. There were 3 waiting days. So an employee or worker would only become entitled to receive statutory sick pay from their 4th day of absence onwards. Those waiting days have now been abolished. So employee or a worker will be entitled to SSP from the 1st day of their sickness absence. There was also a lower earnings limit. You had to earn above that to be entitled to SSP. That lower earnings limit has been abolished. So it means that there's likely to be now more people who are eligible for statutory sick pay for a longer period of time because we've abolished those waiting days. So just make sure that if you're dealing with sickness absence, again, that your payroll processes are up to date to take into account the SSP changes. We also saw the introduction of bereaved partners paternity leave in April. This is a new day one right for all employees, and it's a right to up to 52 weeks unpaid leave, which will be available to an employee whose partner, who would be the mother or the primary adopter of the child, dies within the 1st year of the child's life or placement. So a new entitlement there to bereaved partners paternity leave. We also saw in April the implementation or introduction of the Fair Work Agency. This is a new body that at the moment is taking on some existing oversight and controls of things like adherence and payment of at least national minimum wage, giving people the right holidays, etc. So it's not yet introduced anything new. It's just kind of brought all of these oversight organisations under one umbrella. From April 2026, employers are now required to keep records of annual leave and holiday pay. That information must be kept for at least 6 years. And in April, we also saw that a disclosure of sexual harassment, if it's occurred, is occurring or likely to occur, is explicitly protected under whistleblowing legislation. So those are some of the things that have changed. As I say, there's some signposting in the slides later on to the ACAS website that will, again, tell you and give you the information on those changes. But there are absolutely future changes coming into place, and we're looking at autumn 2026 as the next stage of changes that are coming in. What we typically have with employment law changes is they will typically be implemented in April or in the autumn, and by autumn we're normally looking at October time. There are some deviations from that, and I'll highlight one of those that's coming up, which is due to start on the 1st of January next year. But mainly we're looking at April and October. So at the moment, we think that these future changes are likely to happen in October. So the first change is around what's colloquially known as fire and rehire. This is the situation where an employer dismisses an employee and then automatically seeks to re-engage them or offer them a new contract. That is typically in a situation where it might be less favourable terms. And it's, in my experience, this sort of fire and rehire or dismissal and re-engagement has typically been a situation that's only ever occurred if the organisation has sought to consult with staff and haven't been able to gain their explicit consent to the changes. So it's almost been used as a last resort where the changes have got to come in play. For example, if there was, financial difficulties for the organisation, where they've sought to fire and rehire. But the approach of fire and rehire has had some negative press over recent years through some, probably immoral use of the legislation. So the government is trying to crack down on the use of fire and rehire. So the plan at the moment is to make it automatically unfair unless the organisation is able to evidence urgent financial hardship, so sort of imminent financial hardship as being the primary reason for needing to almost force through changes. Now, at the moment, there is already a code of practice around dismissal and re-engagement. So organisations should, if they're using this, be doing it in a fair manner in line with the code of practice. But what the legislation is going to seek to do is really close down the loophole. So the government have consulted on this, and they have consulted on introducing some situations where it may not become an automatically unfair reason. But as I say, what it looks like is that it will be automatically unfair unless the organisation can evidence imminent significant financial hardship as the primary reason for the change. So it's going to make it very, very narrow circumstances in which a fire and rehire situation would be lawful. Also coming in October is some changes in regard to harassment, and particularly sexual harassment. There were some changes made to legislation in from 2024 onwards around harassment, but key change that's going to be effective in October is a new duty for employers to prevent harassment from third parties. So that could be clients, contractors, the public, if they fail to take all reasonable steps to prevent it. Previously, up to this point, the legislation has been that employers should take reasonable steps to prevent this. We've now got the addition of all reasonable steps. We are waiting on a code around this, and in fact I think we're waiting on possibly some legislation that might come in 2027 that defines what all reasonable steps mean. In the meantime, the Equality and Human Rights Commission issued some guidance on prevention of sexual harassment in the workplace that included 8 steps that an employer could take to prevent sexual harassment. So at the moment, it looks like it's the 8 steps that are sort of set out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission that are probably likely to be the all reasonable steps that employers need to evidence that they have taken to prevent third-party harassment liability. Also, likely to come into place, well, it will come into place, is that the Employment Rights Act will make most non-disclosure agreements, so NDAs, which attempt to silence victims of harassment as unenforceable. Whilst the exact date of implementation isn't known on this yet, we kind of anticipate it'll be autumn time. So we do think that, employers, if it's relevant, should begin to review their use of non-disclosure agreements. Non-disclosure agreements are typically something that would be included within a settlement agreement if you were looking to settle a dispute or a potential claim with an existing or a former employee. But yeah, the Act is likely to mean that non-disclosure agreements, so any clauses around attempts to silence victims of harassment, will become unenforceable. What we're also going to see coming in autumn of 2026 is a change around tribunal time limits. So currently, for most tribunal claims, employees must file a tribunal claim within 3 months of the alleged incident. It's actually 3 months minus 1 day, but we typically refer to it as 3 months. This will normally be 3 months from the alleged incident. So if we were looking at, say, a claim around that was related to an employee's dismissal, then it would be 3 months from the date of dismissal. If we were looking at say a one-off act of discrimination or harassment 3 months from the date of that act. If it were a series of acts of discrimination or harassment, 3 months minus 1 day from the last in the series of those acts. There are some tribunal claim limits where it is 6 months, so the individual has 6 months to bring that, but for the majority it's up to 3 months. What employers have to bear in mind, even with the 3 months as it currently stands, is that time limit can be extended by what's known as early conciliation through ACAS. So early conciliation is where ACAS will attempt to conciliate between the individual raising the claim and the employer to see if the claim can be settled before it gets to a tribunal. And what happens in that period of early conciliation is that, in effect, the clock stops ticking on the time limit to submit a tribunal claim. So it kind of pauses until that period of early conciliation has finished. Now, substantively, the time limit for early conciliation, or the time period for early conciliation, has been 4 weeks. So we would normally say that when you're thinking about tribunal time limitations, think about 3 months plus another month, because you've got 4 weeks for early conciliation. So the clock can pause for 4 weeks. At the moment, because of the volume of claims that are going through and the capacity issues that there have been at ACAS, that early conciliation period has been temporarily extended for 12 weeks. So the time limit around tribunals at the moment, rather than saying 3 months plus think about a month, because you've got 4 weeks of early conciliation, you've got to think about 3 months plus 12 weeks, because early conciliation could pause the time, the clock for a 12-week period as well. So at the moment, you're looking at potentially up to 6 months before you might know that there is a claim that is moving forward into a tribunal. I'll also just highlight the fact that we are seeing where individuals or organisations are going into early conciliation, that it's taking quite considerable time for ACAS to let employers know. So you can be quite a way through that early conciliation period before you actually find out that early conciliation has started. Anyway, what is going to be happening from autumn of this year is that the time limit for claims that are currently 3 months minus 1 day for the claim to be made, the time limit for all claims will be extended to 6 months. So it's 6 months minus 1 day, technically. So that will provide more time for employees or ex-employees to submit a claim to the employment tribunal. And obviously the window, that time limit will still pause for early conciliation. If early conciliation at that stage has gone back down to a month, there could be an additional pause for a month in addition to that 6-month period. If it stays at 12 weeks as it is currently for an extended period of time, then you've got to think 6 months, but there could be a pause of 12 weeks for that early conciliation window. So it's just thinking about awareness for organisations that actually it could take some time for you to be made aware if there is a situation that has now progressed or is progressing to an employment tribunal. So 2027 and beyond, what's happening? Well, this is the one that I want to flag for you and I want to get you thinking about now in preparation for, because the clock is already ticking on this change, which is around unfair dismissals. So talking about tribunal claims, at the moment, an employee needs 24 months or 2 years continuous employment with you as their employer to make a claim of unfair dismissal. Now, there are some automatically unfair dismissal reasons, such as discrimination, whistleblowing, trade union activities, that don't necessarily require the 24-month length of service. But for a general unfair dismissal claim, an employee currently needs 2 years length of service with you before they can bring a claim for unfair dismissal to a tribunal. From January 2027, employees will only need 6 months continuous service with an employer to be eligible to bring a claim for unfair dismissal, obviously if they were dismissed from their employment with you. So the clock is ticking on this. This means that employees who start with you, so if they commence employment with you from the 1st of July, so from next week, they will have protected status from 1st of January. So that means that they will, from 1st of January, they will have sufficient length of service with you to bring a claim for unfair dismissal if their dismissal happens from the 1st of January 2027 onwards. But because the clock is already ticking, that's already in place for some employees who may already have joined your organisation. So anyone who started on, the 1st of June this year, the 1st of April this year, the 1st of January, going back to, 1st of, even back into last year now, thinking about, 1st of June last year, they won't need 2 years length of service to bring a claim for unfair dismissal. Because of their length of service with you, by the time it gets to the 1st of January 2027, if they're dismissed on or after the 1st of January 2027, they will have sufficient length of service to bring a claim for unfair dismissal. So that's important for you to be aware, but it's also something for you to be planning and thinking of in regards to new employees and probation periods. Because unfair dismissal claims, if they become possible after somebody has 6 months length of service with you, then you may need to rethink your probation processes depending upon how they currently run. So organisations at the moment may, and we see this a lot, traditionally have had a probation period, say, of 6 months employment. And traditionally may have had practices whereby if somebody is not necessarily meeting the required expectations of performance, attendance, behaviour within that first 6 months, that employers may seek to extend that probation period, perhaps by a further 3 months. If you get to the stage now where the employee has 6 months service with you, whether you've done a probation review meeting or not, they will now be able to bring a possible claim for unfair dismissal if you bring their employment to an end at the end of their probation period or during their probation period if you've extended it. So it's important to think about probation periods. Now, obviously, of course, we always recommend a fair dismissal process if you are looking to bring a probation period to an end. But to mitigate the risks of claims of unfair dismissal, we do suggest that organisations start looking at and rethink probation processes at the moment. Is it going to be more relevant and more mitigate risks for your organisation by perhaps considering a standard 3-month probation period and thinking about if individuals aren't meeting expectations within that 3-month period, that you could possibly implement an extension period of, say, 2 months, which would then give 5 months to assess whether they are suitable for the role, meeting your expectations, that if required, if those expectations weren't being met, you'd given all the support the individual needed, that you could potentially still do and follow a fair dismissal process, but dismiss fairly without the risk of unfair dismissal claims because you're dismissing before the 6 months, before they've got 6 months employment with you. So that still allows for sort of corrective measures. It still allows for small delays, if you have, say, a manager on annual leave, but you can mitigate the risk of, claims of unfair dismissal if that's managed within that 6-month period. We also do obviously recommend that probation reviews are well documented, that managers are clear in terms of the expectations that you have of them in terms of probations and managing probations. We also think that at some point in 2027, at the moment anyway, it's planned that there's going to be some changes which are sort of under the heading of variable hours protections. And we might talk about these as sort of 0 hours as well. This at the moment, it looks to be including things like the right to be offered guaranteed hours based on the average hours worked over a 12-week reference period. So if you're using casual staff, bank staff, this would potentially, we've got people on 0 hours contracts, this would potentially impact, because you would be having to look on a very regular basis at whether you need to make offers of guaranteed hours to those people based on what work they've undertaken over the previous 12 weeks. Again, this is an area that absolutely needs, and I think it's gone into consultation now, so I think the government are consulting on it. It is, I think, going to be a tricky area for the legislation to cover. It'll be interesting to see what the secondary legislation looks like, because it does feel at the moment like this is going to create an unnecessary burden for a lot of small organisations in particular. A lot of administrative work potentially in looking back over reference periods and hours that people have worked. The proposal is also about introducing some protections for workers on variable or 0 hours. So the right to be given reasonable notice of shifts when they're offered shifts, the right to be given reasonable notice if shifts are cancelled, or to receive compensation if shifts are cancelled or changed at short notice. So as I say, that's in consultation at the moment. It will require secondary legislation, so we wait to see, but just making sure you're aware that that is possible. But again, we don't know if the impact of possible new Prime Minister will change and affect what's coming in. There are other 2027 changes. We don't know as yet when changes will happen. Again, in most cases, these changes will be implemented. They're going to be subject to further consultation, but it'll include things like increased pregnancy and maternity rights, so just strengthening protections against dismissal. Implementation of a new right to statutory bereavement leave. That's an unpaid leave, but again, information in terms of what that looks like, what the eligibility will be for that, we don't know. Small amendments around flexible working law. At the moment, if an employer rejects a request for flexible working, it has to be based on one of the 8 reasons that's set out in legislation. The law is going to change just to say that when you're communicating a refusal of a flexible working request to an employee, not only do you have to state which of the reasons from the 8 is the reason for declining the request, but you also have to explain to the individual in writing why the organisation believes that the refusal of the request is reasonable. There'll be an ACAS code of practice on flexible working. Again, just make sure that that's followed. And as I said, further harassment changes. So we think that the law will specify what all reasonable steps means when that comes in. So still changes to come in 2027 and beyond. I have linked in here to a number of free resources that you can access from Roots HR at any time, which includes up to an hour of free HR consultancy, fact sheets, toolkits. They're also lots of guidance, template documents, whole library of webinars, etc., etc. We also, as part of Small Charity Week, have a number of other offers at the moment. We are offering small charities the right to apply to us for some free HR support. And we have also reopened applications. We offer an 8-week modular line manager training programme, which is around people management for first line managers. So there is, again, I've linked there, it's on our website, on our events and offers page. There is a nomination process where you could nominate line managers within your organisations to potentially be able to attend that free training that we offer. Again, that's part of our social impact. I've signposted here the Employment Rights Act roadmap that the government initially set out, but also, more importantly, the ACAS guidance on the Employment Rights Act timeline, because that does show you what's already been implemented and what's coming up. So you kind of get the past and the future view of that. So that's all the info that I was going to take you through today. So I want to move through into questions. So I'm just going to ask Charlotte to come back. And yes, good afternoon, everybody.